and much as the fact that most of the authors of those books grew out of free inquiry and the Council for Secular Humanism, if you read our journal. Nonetheless, we consider ourselves to be a secular movement, not simply an atheist movement. Namely, we're appealing to the large number of people in the world who are secular, who are non-religious. Maybe that better defines us. We're a non-religious movement. And there are many people within the churches. I met a man who says, I'm a Methodist, but I agree with you. And I replied, well, some of my best friends are Methodists, so I'm not going to hold it against you because you're a Methodist. But he shares everything that we say. We have a powerful message of real, and I'll get into that message later on tonight. Well, if we continue, so you see that throughout the world, the movement for a new enlightenment, new education, new appreciation, beyond the religious pieties, beyond the sensational media, an effort to develop public education. And so the Center for Inquiry is interested primarily in public education. We are a think tank, and we do advocate a whole number of things. Yes, and so we're an advocacy group, particularly today, and the great battle, the press release you issued yesterday or the day before, Justin, about the censorship of a book here in Toronto, things like that, we need to constantly oppose. Now, I've been involved in the secular humanist movement for all my life. Someone said, what did you say? Sexual humorist? No, I said, we believe in sex and I believe in humor, but we're secular humanists. I was once visited by the Vice Squad in Buffalo, New York, and he said, what is this, promiscuous books? I said, that's Prometheus books. How do you spell that? Who the hell was Prometheus? There's a large amount of education that we have to do. I'm very happy that I've known most of the leading humanists in the world. I was a student at Columbia University, where I took my doctorate a long time ago. And I remember being in the philosophy club, and we invited John Dewey to be present. He was a great philosopher. This was really thrilling. And he came there. He says, shucks, I didn't think anybody remembered me. He had a standing ovation at that time, but he is remembered, of course. And there were so many others throughout the world. One of the most touching experiences of my life was to get to know Andrei Zakharov, who signed Humanist Manifesto 2. I guess you can pull it off. Who signed Humanist Manifesto 2 when that was issued in 1973. I managed to get that to him by courier. He was placed under house arrest and a battle for human rights. Okay. Humanism has a very distinguished history. Andrei Zakharov was a great humanist and a secularist. And when the Russian tanks invaded Czechoslovakia, he stood in Red Square and said, honor the Constitution. And as a result, he was arrested and persecuted for many, many years. When Gorbachev came to power, he released Andrei Zakharov. And I had been involved in the international humanist movement and was very pleased to present him with an International Humanist Award at S.D. Lauder's apartment on Park Avenue in New York. I was very honored. And he said, Professor Kurtz, I'm very glad to see you, and I'm very honored to have this award. He was there with a thread-worn gray suit, and he had, like Stevenson, holes in the soles of his shoes. He says, there's one thing I do not like. I said, what is that? He says, your criticism of religion. Well, I was shocked, because as you know, I spent my life in criticizing religion. But in the Soviet Union at that time, and before, thousands and perhaps millions of people were persecuted for their religious beliefs. And as secular humanists, we believe in the right to believe or not to believe. And that is a human right, freedom of conscience. So I sympathize with Zakharov in that situation. Well, let me say something about the history of humanism. Next slide, please. And of course, one of the key figures is Socrates. I remember a janitor once I showed this, he said, he sure must be intelligent because he sure is ugly. But he was a great philosopher, really great philosopher. And he kept alive the spirit of inquiry. Next slide, please. Why don't you bring the whole thing up and we'll go one after the other. And it's a history of free thought. And this was Galileo Galilei, because he suffered at the hands of the Inquisition and was placed under house arrest. He stands up as a beacon light for the need for freedom of thought and freedom of inquiry. And so free thought is part of the whole of human history. David Hume, that great skeptic. I'm bringing up some of the great figures in the history of thought. The leader of the Scottish Enlightenment. Next. Voltaire, yes, Voltaire, the philosopher in the 18th century France who led to the Enlightenment. Next slide. You go one after the other. James Madison, who wrote the American Constitution and the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, especially the First Amendment. Thomas Jefferson, doesn't look like him. I hope we have a younger Thomas Jefferson, who said religion is tyranny of the mind of man, often. Tom Paine, an Englishman who wrote the Age of Reason while he was imprisoned in France. He's said by George Washington. Okay, next slide, please. Charles Darwin. The attack on Darwin today is so embarrassing, so distressing, that this is happening in the United States. One of the great figures of 19th century science. George Sand, the French novelist, very, very important. Marie Curie stands out in the 20th century as a great free thinker. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wrote the book The Woman's Bible, and the women's movement in the United States, which was founded in 1848, the leaders of that feminist movement were predominantly secularists and humanists, and atheists too. John Dewey, we talked about him earlier, probably the leading philosopher in the United States in the 20th century. And Bertrand Russell, yes, Bertrand Russell, the great 20th century British philosopher who stood for peace and was against the nuclear bomb, developed a campaign against that. And that is Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, the leader of the feminist movement in France. Isaac Asimov, a dear friend of mine, he published over 500 books, and I was pleased that as the founder of Prometheus Books, that we published 5 of his books, and he would send them almost immaculate. I had a photograph of memory without any need for editing. This is Betty Friedan. Let me tell you about Betty Friedan. I'm sorry that Henry Morgentaler is not here tonight. I must give him a call. But when Henry Morgentaler was imprisoned in Canada, I organized an international committee to defend Henry Morgentaler. Remember, he was placed twice after the